Kevin Winter has been a senior lecturer in the Environmental Geographical Science Department at the UCT, University of Cape Town. Okay? And he is the principal researcher at the Urban Water Management Research Group of the ENGO since 2004, and he's involved in lots of projects about water-sensitive urban areas and design in Cape Town and surrounding areas. So please welcome Professor Kevin Winter.
It's already your
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction. Very nice to be here. We share a number of common aspects of living in a city. I don't think my city is anywhere near as beautiful as yours. I've enjoyed just a couple of moments to walk around your city. It is really wonderful to be here. We share a couple of things, though, in that I live in a city in a Mediterranean climate, and so do you. We live in a city that's using the same amount of water currently as you do, roughly, and Lorenzo has just introduced you to about the 450 million liters of water that your entire city and the metropolitan area are using. So we share some commonalities there. And we also share, finally, this risk of climate change and weather variability, which makes our city, 4.5 million people, at great risk. And so I want to talk today about how we dealt with avoiding day zero. There's a bit of luck, there's a bit of science, and there's, thirdly, a government, a local authority that suddenly sprang into action. I think a little too late, but they got it together in the end. And so this might be a very important conversation this evening, because it might help us to initiate an early intervention to avoid day zero. And so I want to congratulate both the organizers, the BBVA for the initiative that you've taken in supporting this program, and the municipalities and other private organizations that have been responsible for the series and bringing some very important talks together. Yes, it's about the city, rethinking, replanning, and reacting. But also, I think we've got to acknowledge what we have in the city, both in Cape Town and in Barcelona, and helping to make progress in that. It's a transition, not a sudden reaction that creates revolutions that you can't easily control. Do you see where I'm going to with this? It's progress that we need to be looking at. Sustainability is a goal, and we need to keep that in place in our minds. Resilience is an important goal, and we need to look at how we measure that resilience. But be careful, as we say in English, that you don't throw the baby out with the bath water, that you don't always call for new plans and policy. You get to grips with and understanding what your policy and plans are, and you make progress from there. So be careful not to overreact. I constantly in Cape Town are listening to people saying, well, we've got to start again. We've got to revolutionize this and be more radical in what we're doing. And while there might be some truth in that, I think we also need to be careful about overreacting sometimes as well and look at what we've got. Let's manage the water that we have rather than trying to go into looking for new sources of water. And you'll see that in one of the ways in which I believe we've escaped two things in the city of Cape Town. One is day zero, and the other is what I believe would have been a catastrophe if we had invested in a crisis and found ourselves now in debt and in a country that cannot afford to be in debt. That would have been another long-term crisis for us. So those two quick messages up front. So what can we learn about day zero? Now, first of all, and I'll give you a moment for those who are listening on the channel at this stage, how many people have visited Cape Town? I know you have. Put up your hands if you visited Cape Town. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Thank you. So most of you haven't been to see it, and I'll just give you a bit of introduction on the Cape Town story. We marketed day zero very well, didn't we? Because the whole world got to understand a new concept. And now there are plenty of cities around the world saying, when is our day zero? And day zero for us was not going to be a day of no water at all. It was going to be a day in which 75% of the taps around the city were going to be closed off. And we then were going to be lining up for water. And I'll try and show you a little video clip if it comes up just now on that. We would stand in a place of distribution, of water distribution. There were 200 of these proposed around the city. And every one of us would go with our 25-liter container, a big bucket, stand in line, and we would collect our water for the day. That's what day zero would mean for us. And when we looked at the plans, we said, that's unworkable. In fact, that's a catastrophe, and we have to avoid that catastrophe. And I will talk a little bit about how we avoided the absolute failure. And cities of the size of 4.5 million, Barcelona included, cannot afford to fail and be without water. And that's why this is a very important conversation today, because it might mean that somewhere in all of this, in our discussions, some of you will start to take this forward and will put pressure both on the municipality and on national government and on the private sector, and most of all in citizen behavior, to avoid if you even start to get close to it. So it's an important conversation today. What can we learn? Well, that's probably iconic. Whether you've been to Cape Town or not, that background picture there of Table Mountain is something that everyone wants to at least acknowledges we've seen before. Let's see if I can get this video clip to quickly play in the background here. What the city of Cape Town did was to, as far as possible, create a media frenzy, one in which we tried to put as much
Cape Town
energy.
is currently facing its worst drought ever. The city would like to thank each and every resident who has been reusing grey water,
Yeah, it's on YouTube,
only
yeah.
flushing when they really
It's just
need
in the
to,
background.
taking stop-start showers,
Okay.
and doing
It's
everything
there,
they
so we
can
do it up
to
here.
save the water we have
There we
left.
go. Thank you, and I'll do
But
that.
not enough
And just pick up the sound again.
It's essential that everyone joins up. Cape Town is currently facing its worst drought ever.
Sorry, I should have
The
warned you.
city would like to thank each and every resident
It came up
who's
quite
been
loud just
reusing
now.
grey water, only flushing
so-
when they really
I
need
think
to,
that we have to go
taking
on.
stop-start
That's okay.
showers, and doing everything they can.
And let's see if I can do this quickly here.
No.
It's 100%, yeah. Okay.
The presentation
Okay.
is still on. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So we have been building a desalination plant. We have been doing lots of budget cuts to try and deal with the crisis. We've tried to reduce the amount of water that individuals were using, and we've also tried to get into the groundwater as well. And so let me just cut the screen here because I can't get to it. Let's go back to where I was here, and I'll proceed from here. That's fine. Nothing lost in it in terms of a presentation. But we got ourselves in the news for all the wrong reasons. You don't want a city to hit headlines as we did. You don't want a city that's reliant on tourism to find itself challenged in this way. And tourists who were booking tickets for coming to Cape Town in September of 2017 suddenly decided this is going to be a grand stay away. We're not going to come. Okay. And that was the headlines in Time magazine. 90 days ahead. This happened on the 15th of January. And on the 18th of January, the mayor, who became a very powerful voice in persuading the Cape Townians, the citizens, to reduce their water demand, said that on the 18th of January, we are moving from day possible to day probable. And the citizens panicked. And by the end of that weekend, there was barely a supermarket store with any water on its shelves. People reacted in a way we never anticipated, with fear and panic. And just to try and help you, there's only a complicated diagram I'm going to give you this evening, so relax. But let me just see if I can show you through, take you through the diagram. This is rainfall beginning in 1920 here. And it shows that in 1920 we had roughly 600 millimeters of rainfall in the catchment areas in 1920. We then had some quite decent rainfall through the years, and we got an interval of drought here in the 1970s, roughly 3 or 4 years of drought, 1969 to 1974. And again, we bounced back to some really good years, and you can see that rainfall or weather variability changes our rainfall pattern, and you start to get these cyclical years. And we used to speak of every 7 years being a good rainfall period, and then down into a trough of lower rainfall. Look at the pattern. It seems to be ironic. Bad year, good year. Bad year, or years, good years. Good years. Bad year. Really good year, 2014, and then suddenly the worst we've ever had on record. 2017, somewhere here, the lowest amount of rainfall we had measured on record. The chances of that happening is a 1 in 300 year chance. For the engineers among you, we don't plan for 1 in 300 year failure. You can't do that. That's too expensive. So that's where we're at. And we've had 4 years of well below average rainfall. There's our average of 711 in the region. And there is our period of pain, and where we had 60% less average rainfall in 2017. That's a catastrophe. And the first, if you're asking me today, what's the real cause for day zero? It's the lack of rainfall. So the first answer to why we found ourselves in this very difficult position. So 5 things I want to share with you today about how we managed to move our way out of this drought and what comes now, what comes next. And those are the lessons that might be useful for our discussion following. First of all, you need to manage your water demand. You need to know what that water demand is, and you need to start managing it. In other words, know your numbers. Know what is being demanded of the system. Know what individuals and different sectors, agriculture, industry, business, are using, and start to get a better control. That might sound obvious to you, and I don't know what you do in Barcelona, but there are many countries and cities that do not meter their water at all. They pay a fixed cost. I do know that Barcelona measures your water in your individual households, and you also have a fixed cost. But for many other countries, they pay a flat rate and do not have proper control and know what individuals are using. Cape Town is a metered city. It's metered through an analog system. And let me just try and quickly explain that. We have 2,000 people who are involved in going to a neighborhood of some 1 million households every month, checking their meter. You can imagine how difficult that is. And so old systems, analog systems, reading a dial is really difficult. And we need to move into, obviously, the digital age. And there are many cities around the world, Australians in particular, Melbourne City at the moment, who are starting to invest in electronic metering of all of their systems so that they can be controlled, and you can at any one moment know what the value of the amount of water that's been used at any one point. So managing that is really important. Here's the story, a slightly simpler graph, and this one here shows us what happened in the Cape Town story. On the left-hand side shows the amount of liters of water that the city was using in a day. In 2014, we were using roughly, at that point, 1.2 billion liters of water. Barcelona, 450 million liters of water. We were way over the top. And there will be some conversations, I'm sure, in questions. How did you do that? Why were you using water to such an extent? And what we've done from 2014 in November right down to where we are, day 0, and water restrictions, brought it right down to about 480 was the best we ever got, 480 million liters per day. And this line here is our target. We should be at 450 million liters. We've never, ever got close to that. We're around about 500, and we're watching that very carefully. Just as in the introduction, we were seeing how Barcelona has moved from 2009, roughly 130 liters per person, right down to 100, and you've stayed there. That's remarkable. And we want to learn lessons from Barcelona as to how you're doing it, because we're worried that that is going to start to move up again. And how can we keep behavior and use of water to a level which remains roughly 500 million liters per day? So that's what we've done. And what's remarkable is the speed with which they brought it down. And so when we look at the success of Cape Town, that's the one thing that people recognize. How did you do that? And so a little bit about how we did that, coming up right now. Here's one. This is a street map. And for those who, well, let me explain it first of all. That's where I live. And there's the marker. And that's the earth, the plot number. This is the street that I live in, Cape Town. And these are my neighbors. I've got a green dot, and I'm quite proud of that green dot, because it means that my household of 4 has managed to stay for that month under 6,000 liters per person. It means that my family members have been using less than 50 liters of water per person per day. That's the gold star, in our case, the green button. I can go onto that map on the website every week, and I can check to see what I've done. And if I'm really nosy, I can go and look at what my neighbors are doing as well. But it became not one of blame, but one of saying, it's very nice that I've got a green, dark green. The lighter green is 10,500 liters per day. And now the question is, how could you do that? How could you invade an individual's privacy by displaying that on the map? And so when I speak to American audience, they say, oh, you couldn't do that. You would find yourself in a civil court. There'd be litigation cases against you. How dare you? But they got past it. And they did it for one reason, which cushioned it, made it easier, is that every now and again you'll see a white dot or a white mark. And that usually means we couldn't read your meter. We couldn't get access to your property. Or it was well beyond 10,000 liters, and we're not going to show you a black star or a black dot to show that you really were bad. In other words, it was no blame game. And there was some doubt as to what had actually happened that month. So I couldn't go over to my neighbor and say, I saw on your map you had a white dot, and you're pretty naughty. Can you actually bring yourself in line with what we're all trying to do as a collective? Okay, so there's the story. Another way of nudging people to try to get below that 50 liters per person per day. You're at 100, and you're living reasonably comfortably, I would imagine. At 50 liters, we found ourselves relatively comfortable in meeting that particular target as well. So it is amazing that as you shift these targets, it's incredible how people adapt. And we didn't have any major health outbreaks. We didn't have any health scares of any sorts. So it's interesting what we are capable of handling. And not that I'm advocating that you get to 50 liters. I think that the norm is shifting in countries, Mediterranean countries in particular, that maybe we're going to get closer to 100. Maybe you spot on, I don't know. So that was one of the things that had happened in the communication. Then this other comment, point number 2. So there's number 1, managing the demand, and I'm just doing a little bit of an overview of what we did to give you some ideas that were quite novel. The rest is probably obvious, we know that. We know what could be done. But it's some of these little novel ideas that became interesting, that others around the world said, we've never tried that. That may be useful to try. Then you don't manage what you don't measure. Very useful. Increasingly, we've gone from water demand management to managing that water, second point, to managing that water better, to measuring that water better. And that was a big catch-up call for the city of Cape Town to start managing and monitoring better. So one of the things that they did was to put in into these household meters what's called a water management device, a WMD. And it was anyone who exceeded constantly 10,500 liters per month, in other words, more than 50 liters per person per day, was forced to accept a WMD. Poor households that also exceeded their water allocation were also forced to accept WMDs. And they became called weapons of mass destruction because people really found that they struggled with the restriction. You were restricted to 350 liters of water in your household per day. If you exceeded that, then you could be without water until the next 24 hours clocked up. So very difficult. And so people who were poor often live in households with more than 4 people. And there was no system to enable them to increase the allocation. And so it left them constantly without water, and hence they call them weapons of mass destruction, because being without water at a certain time of the day simply created a nasty, unpleasant environment for them. Third point, and I'll spend a little more time on this because I think this is interesting. Because what's happened is that we've, in a sense, saved the city through water demand management and through behavioral adjustment. And of course, a lot of luck, which I'll come to just now, it rained. But this is the plan that is moving forward. And let me just say to you the significance of a crisis. Crises create opportunities. And you need to make sure that in a crisis, you begin to contribute as much as you can from there. And myself as an academic, I became strongly involved with the city's Resilient Committee. We've met for the last 18 months. We've met every month, and we've talked about how we are managing and assisting to manage the water situation. So I became deeply embedded in the process. And one of the things that I've been involved with for a number of years, as Lorenzo introduced me, was in how do we build a water-sensitive city? I could not have had this discussion with the city 2 years ago. We weren't even talking about water-sensitive cities. And so now the whole crisis has caused a change in that conversation. And we're now steering that city. The city's got a vision, and in that vision is to build a water-sensitive city. So let me explain and give you some examples of what that water-sensitive is, because it doesn't really seem like it's easy to define. You need to see examples of it, and I'll just give you some examples of it from elsewhere. But before we get into it, let me say why we need to get into a water-sensitive city. And this is Table Mountain in the background here. This is Table Bay. And this is the growing sprawl, the expansion of the city of Cape Town going into new areas on the periphery, on the edge of the city. That's not a view of a sustainable city, of a city that should be becoming more efficient with its water, with its energy, with its waste. You don't easily manage a scale of city that simply expands. We have 11,000 kilometers of pipelines, of water pipeline alone. I can fly from here to Barcelona, and that's the sort of extent and more of our pipelines. That's in the city alone. It is huge. Sewerage is about 8,000 kilometers, so covering largely the distance across Africa. So it's not making sense to continue to expand. And what's that expansion look like? It's single households that have large gardens around them and long distances from the places where people work. It's inefficiency. We're growing too fast, we're spreading too far. But what if we start thinking about the area that the city is in differently? What if we start to use the idea, and you can't see it on the board because it's just cut off on the screen there, but can cities become the catchment? We mostly take our water from elsewhere, don't we? It comes from dams, in the case of Cape Town. 98% of our water comes from dams that are situated outside the metropolitan boundaries. We import in the water, essentially, from great distances to get them to the city. And yet, we're actually sitting on a dam ourselves. This entire area here is a sandy aquifer, and it is our underground dam. And so we've never begun to really explore that underground dam and the water that it holds underneath that dam. Can cities become catchments, both in terms of capturing water in storage tanks and also allowing that water to go underground? 3 times as much water falls on the city of Cape Town as what we actually need. And it's a no-brainer, is it? Let's see if we can then try to capture that water. So how do we make cities more livable? And here's an example of a model of cities that are taking water much more seriously in their planning, of showcasing water, of helping people to connect with water. And in Singapore, they have this very nice motto, a logo that goes with it, that tries to sensitize people in engaging with water, in relating better to water. It says, as most cities have got, conserve water. It says value water. Most cities have got that. But the third one is really important, I think, too. It says enjoy water. So the logo is water to conserve, value, and enjoy. And the enjoy part helps us to make cities that are much more livable. And I'm sure there'll be a conversation just now about, say, the role that swimming pools play in our daily lives in a city, in warm cities in a Mediterranean climate. And Cape Town is in a similar situation to that. But the point about this is, for planners here, how do we bring water into a city and showcase that water? And rather than always working with water as something which is high risk, is something we've got to be always conserve, and very little around the word enjoyment. So here's Singapore, which is probably the water hub of the world. If you really want to know about water planning, go along to what Singapore has done in the last 30 to 40 years. Remarkable, and I would describe them as the water hub of the world. So here's one instance. This is a canalized river that many cities have because our planning is structured around getting rid of water. That's what the engineers did to us in the 1960s and said, let's get rid of the water to reduce the flood risk to cities. All well and good. But we suddenly realized that as cities become drier and drier, we should be keeping the water within the city. We should be slowing the flow. We should be cleaning the water within the city itself rather than discarding it and sending it out to sea. And so what the Singaporeans have done here is take this canal and opened it up, literally blown the canal out the water, moved houses off the edges of these canals, and created high-rise compact buildings alongside. Compact cities are going to save the planet. Compact cities could ultimately save the planet because of the efficiencies that creates with the economies of scale, with transport, with resource access, and so on. And cities are expanding rapidly. In Africa and in South Africa, it's a wave of people moving into the cities in order to try to find a way to get out of poverty, a way to actually address their fundamental needs. There's another example of Singapore. Wonderful park-like structure, cooling down the city, and then these high-rise departments alongside. And of course, not everyone, particularly Africans, don't want to live in departments like that. They want their own space, their own yard. And so we have an enormous amount of mindset changes that need to take place to be able to bring about that change. But think about it, and it may be provocative to you, that cities will save the planet. Cities will save the planet. Here's an example of a city that some of you, I'm sure, would have been to. Anyone recognize the city? It's Mexico City. I stumbled across it 4 weeks ago by chance. And what it is a green corridor that runs in the middle of the city through a major highway. Cars going that side, cars coming on the other side here. And what they're doing is they are taking stormwater, grey water, and sewage water and treating it in the middle of the city with bioreactors and using nature-based processes to clean that water as it comes all the way back. And these plants are growing on water which has been treated by nature-based processes. In other words, without adding chemicals to that water to treat it, and using that water productively to grow plants and to cool down the center of the city, to create green infrastructure. And that's a little bit about what it looks like. So water's coming down through these tanks over here. Reeds are doing some of the job in picking up some of the phosphate. That water comes back here into some fish ponds, which adds some protein. I don't know if they were eating that at all, but certainly adds to the cleansing of that water. 1 kilometer away from that is what they're doing on the edges of the pathway. These are low swimming pools, and they put benches in the swimming pool. So you take your shoes off on a warm day, you put your feet in, and it just makes such a difference to the temperature in the city. And we saw lots of people, largely old people, who had time on their hands with their feet in the water. What a clever idea in terms of doing that in that space. I think that's world beater. And I've been to loads of cities. I've never seen something like that before. And of course, what the authorities are worried about is, can we continue to sustain it? It has to be patrolled 24 out of 7, 24 hours, 7 days a week. There's a load of people involved here. The security alone is 90 personnel, 90 people involved here. So it has a cost implication. And so be careful, by the way, if you're going to become a green infrastructure protagonist, one who pushes the idea of green technology, be careful that you know what the implications might be. There's a good example in Mexico City, and one that I think is fascinating, but it also needs to be very carefully monitored from there. So there's CDM, MX. Who's been to Mexico City? Lots of people, I'm sure. You must have all been here, and some Mexican nationals here as well with us from there, called Ecoducto. I think it's a remarkable piece of work that they're doing there. And even if it's experimental, we need to learn from those experiments. We're doing something similar in Cape Town. Here's a canal in a neighborhood, and I want to quickly tell you the story because it's quite a useful one as to how we connect people with nature and with water. The canal over here was absolutely bare, a bit like the one I showed you in Singapore. And what we did as a community-based organization was to allow the reeds to grow onto the top of that canal. And in doing that, it collected sand and other stones and rocks around it. It created an ecosystem. And within 4 years, we started seeing animals we've never seen before. We saw indigenous fish coming into this canal. We saw frogs. We saw otters, freshwater otters, swimming in the stream. And you know what? It woke people up to nature in their city. And you know what further happened is that Cape Town, being a very unequal city, with homeless people living alongside a river because that's where they get access to water. They often use their own, the river as their toilet, their ablutions, and they're often quite heavily involved in drinking and are alcoholics, to some of them. And so the neighborhood attracted, the river, the changes in the river attracted attention. The neighborhood then got some money and built a path alongside the river. The neighbors then started to grow plants along the side of the river and to soften the edges of the canal. And then they went further to build a garden here, a vegetable garden, so that the homeless could get vegetables from the garden. And then they got interested in who the homeless were. And they then started talking about what are the names of these homeless people? Why are they there? Could we help them? And could the homeless become part of helping us to manage this river? And so it's interesting that ecology started an interesting chain of events, which led from ecological improvement, a diversity of animals and birds that came into this area, to a point at which people became interested and related to each other. And now there's a group of that neighborhood who every Thursday evening meet with the homeless people over dinner and talk to them about how their week has been. Isn't it interesting that humanity can be drawn into nature-based processes? And we often underestimate the power of nature to change people's behavior and interest in each other. And I don't know whether it'll work for you here, but for us, that becomes so much more powerful than many of the behavioral education programs that we've tried to institute. And then this is a plug for the academics, researchers, students amongst us. And it's a message to the private sector here and also to the municipalities. Value what researchers can do. Embrace and bring researchers into the cities, the municipalities program. That's really important. And the project that I'm showing you in the background is one of a mega scale that we're doing in Cape Town in a little village or town, near a town called Franschhoek. And what we're doing is turning an old abandoned wastewater treatment works into a recovery center. Isn't it interesting that in the past we've talked about wastewater treatment plants and we've emphasized the word waste. And now we talk about it differently, as a recovery. What resources can we recover that we previously have been discarding? So what about phosphate, for instance? Water that comes into and through a center like this, heavily laced, lots of concentrations of phosphate. And phosphate, like peak oil, has reached its peak point. We're going to need more phosphate in the years going forward. So can we find this contaminated water, usually runoff from an urban surfaces and also from agriculture, and begin to extract that? And there's lots of other extractions taking place. But the point about the slide is look at what researchers are doing. And if you're a city official here today, find out what researchers are doing in the local universities, talk to them, and ask them to deal with some of the data that you've got lying around your offices, because maybe they can be very efficient at analyzing that data for you. And we have begun an interesting relationship over this crisis with the City of Cape Town officials and ourselves as researchers. And we are meeting with them over breakfast quite regularly now to talk about how we can work together. Again, emphasis of how a crisis turns into an opportunity and how we're starting to work together. And I think we can, the message is, of course, do this earlier. Don't wait for a crisis. We shouldn't be waiting for a crisis. We should be trying to find better ways to work together. Fourth point, and then go very quickly through this one here. I believe that cities have to lead, that municipalities shouldn't necessarily wait for national governments who are slow to react. Cities have to take the lead. You can't do it all on your own, obviously, as cities. You have a national framework and you have legislation to follow. But you can take the lead. And if you take the lead, government tends to follow, particularly if you start doing things that cause the rest of the world to wake up and say, you're doing something really special there. And so in the city of Cape Town, I think what's happened over the last 2 years is that we've built increasingly competencies, institutional, as in municipal competencies around water management that we've never had before. Secondly, that we've built a technical competency through interactions with the university, through officials interacting with other private technologists, engineers, managers, and scientists. And it's just a photograph to illustrate a little bit how much interest the Cape Town Water was able to attract. These are some technicians, engineers who've been in the city of Cape Town, Peter Flower, for decades, a wealth of knowledge. And you need those people of stability in a crisis to keep their heads together and focused on what you're trying to do. This fellow here, you may recognize him, is Mike Bloomberg from Bloomberg TV, Bloomberg Channel. He flew in and he wanted to talk to us about how the United Nations climate change can be directed more towards cities. And he's written a wonderful book, Mike Bloomberg's book on cities in climate change. And as you probably know, he was mayor of this New York City for 12 years, for 3 periods. And his book provides us with some great insights into maybe how cities can lead and to the opportunities that New York used. So building technical competencies and strength of that is another way in which I believe the city of Cape Town was able to steer its way out of the crisis. And there's lots of things around that. The other way in which that technical competency was displayed was a website, and that website was available to everyone, obviously, on a weekly basis. Every week, the water use in the city, and the water use in this case, 556 million litres. That's on Monday this week, or the week before, I should say. I don't know, we were on dates at this stage. But that's the latest update in terms of the amount of water that the city is using. 18 months ago, I had no idea what the water was using, how much water the city was using. Now we can get that every day, every week on a Monday at 2 o'clock. This is the amount of water that has changed in the dam levels since the previous week. And this is our current storage capacity towards the end of October, 75%. The rule of thumb for us, by the way, is by the time we get to the end of October, we should have 80% water in our dams. And we should never allow our dams, our main storage, to be less than 30%. So we're about 5% under, which means we can get through 2019 reasonably well, and hopefully it will rain in April again, and we can deal with it from there. But that data is now available for the first time. The model that we were using to steer ourselves out of day zero is presented on the diagram here. There is our pathway since November 2017. This is the actual amount of water that we had in our dams. And there we went, heading for this blue line here called day zero. And we got to a point where we were just below 20% of water left in our dams. So the 30% rule had been broken there. A city of 4.5 million, you don't dare bring them to below 30%, because that risk to health, to productivity, to the economy is at great risk. And we call these zones danger zone, critical zone, and failure zone. And we were in at one stage the danger zone. And that's where we are right now. We got some great rainfall in April and brought us right up to this point right now. And we expect we're going to go down once again into this little pattern, but probably well out of the danger zone. The reason why I'm showing you that slide is because this city was able to show its data. It was able to be increasingly transparent and open about the models that it was using to make its decisions. And that's an important contribution to building trust and to communicating with its citizens. And there are other cities that have done an alternative, who've said, let's keep quiet. Let's just hold out and hopefully it rains. Hopefully we can make a plan. And there are cities in the world that have come very, very close and didn't make a squeak or a sound. And some of them have been very lucky. Last of all, and here's to get to the climate part. For us, it's no longer a question of saying, do you believe in climate change? Is it something that we've got to subscribe to? Do we have to find enthusiasm for climate change? What we've done and seen in the city of Cape Town is that climate change is real. We've observed it, and we've experienced it. So you can call it climate change, or you could call it weather variability. The fact is, we've had very, very low rainfall. And here's the diagram, which gives us a little bit of an understanding of where the models are going to. Briefly, and I'll just circle those things there. There's Cape Town, the bottom of Africa, and this is climate in 2050. This is what the projected climate change is going to look like. Now, obviously, you haven't got a clear scale in front of you, but I can just describe this to you and to say that these models, based on 16 different models from the international, well, in fact, from modeling that has been done in the International Panel for Climate Systems and Climate Change, shows us that we are moving towards a much warmer environment in the Western Cape here, that we're moving into a much drier climate here. And so you can't ignore the signs, and climate change is long-term. That's why we all get a bit confused about subscribing and believing in climate change. It's long-term studies that you have to focus on. Weather variability is different, because that's what we've experienced. Climate change is long-term. Watch the models and watch them more carefully. And they might be slightly wrong, but in general, they're pointing to us in a Mediterranean climate where there's something serious going on. Our weather patterns are changing. And it seems to us, by the way, that the warming of the ocean may well be affecting the upper atmosphere. And that upper atmosphere is causing our cold front systems to disappear southwards. And time again, over the last 2 years, we've watched the cold fronts, what we call mid-latitude cyclones, head their way towards the Western Cape and then disappear. go southwards because of a very powerful high-pressure system that's dominated, that's been the main force moving those cold fronts further southwards. My penultimate slide. It's a warning to us all around the world, and this is a report from the C40 cities on climate change. And I wrote that little text on the top over there because, for me, the report is so depressing. The report has got a title, is a future we don't want. And who wants to write a book, The Future We Don't Want, and expect anybody to read it? But who wants, more importantly, to have their children's children live in a climate that becomes impossible to live in, an unlivable, uninhabitable climate? And the statistics, and you don't need to read these at all, but they are loaded with warning signs of what might happen when we are getting to that 2050 over here, where 1.6 billion people will be exposed to extreme temperatures around the world in cities. That more than 800 million people in 570 cities will be vulnerable to coastal seawater rise. Our cities could look very different if we start to overshoot that 1.5 degrees Celsius rise. They will look incredibly different if we get even close to 5 degrees Celsius. We will not see, from what we can imagine at this stage, a planet which still has glaciers on it, that still has a North Sea, an Arctic and an Antarctic ice pack. They will have disappeared at 5 degrees Celsius. We will have transported ourselves over the tipping point. And tipping points are serious because they set off a number of other systems that begin to collapse with them. So coastlines, for instance, will look very different well, I can't tell you when it's going to occur, but if we start to get to 5 degrees Celsius increase. And most of all, at the bottom over here, 650 million people run the risk of declining water quality. I've talked mostly about water supply today, but I have to say I'm much more worried in my own country about water quality than I am about water supply and quality, because I think that's where the real challenges do lie as well, because there's many things we're finding in our water, new emerging chemicals, drugs, pharmaceuticals, that could potentially be far more serious. And so there's where the big challenge is in water quality. So in conclusion, a city without water is a failure. Let's recognize that. We need to adapt much faster to climate change and to what we're doing to our own cities that are encouraging the warming of the city, and to considering how much of methane and carbon is coming off our cities and being released into the atmosphere. We need to invest much more, first of all, in water demand management as a priority. Bring that under control. I think what it sounds like, Barcelona has done this really well and has managed to keep that level of water per person down to at least a stable value. We need to invest much better in water reuse than looking for new supplies. And I said in the very beginning, I'm grateful that we escaped two things in the city of Cape Town. We dodged day zero, and we dodged a long-term debt caused by investing in a crisis. When you invest in a crisis, you create new crises long-term. And so, last point, avoid investing in a crisis. Plan earlier. Watch the signs earlier. And if you see, like we saw and should have reacted earlier, 2 consecutive years of well below average rainfall, the bells should have rung loud and clear. And the machinery to bring about a change should have happened at that point. And we waited another 18 months before things really started to change. We can't take those risks any longer with a climate change that's coming at us much faster than we think. And it's a rapid process. Thank you very much indeed for your listening, your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kevin. Before giving the ground for questions, what I would like, if you allow me, it's just sharing with the audience, not my point of view, my remark, but sharing with you what we actually have been both discussing yesterday. Yesterday we have a long session with our students at the master degree, and there are a few points that I would like to share with you about how we perceive and how we leverage on the crisis, and how we face them, and how we frame the solutions. And this is also a point for highlighting the similarities and warning messages comparing Barcelona and Cape Town. So when in Barcelona we face a drought, during the very drought, we react to the emergency by, among other things, so as Cape Town, reducing the water consumption, and during the emergency we just built the European bigger desalination plant, right? And we now have it near here, the city. And so this was our decision taken during the emergency, right? And this is something that I would like to highlight, because now we are 10 years after the emergency, and we have now this source of resiliency, okay? We have that infrastructure as a buffer. We feel more secure because in case of another emergency, we can use them, okay? And the reflection I would like to share with you is that there are different perspectives about how we react to crisis in relationship to the decision-making process and the social implication of that. So there is a concept which we've been discussing yesterday, which is lockings. Locking means when you're locked, okay, because of a decision taken to follow a determined development path, okay, because you take a decision and you have to follow that decision, and that decision has usually long-term implications. So you're stuck, let's say, okay, this is a locking. So the reason I would like to share with you is that from one side, we've been discussing that crisis and emergencies is always good opportunity, okay? It's not always bad. It's not always to be advertising like we are in a huge crisis and then has these negative messages, but try to capitalize that crisis. And there is a moment in which you need to take a hard decision, which is take decision during the emergency, or just try to escape the emergency phase and then rethink and replan the future development of the city, a new way of thinking about how to get rid of that problem in future. And both in Cape Town and Barcelona, we have this desalt issue, the desalt plan. So in Cape Town, during the emergency, they just start to brainstorm about a variety of solutions, right? Among which, correct me if I'm wrong, no, 10 or more desalination plants, and try to get the future we want through desalt, and hypotheses about how to do that in order to ensure that you could have enough water, because we can literally create new water, right? Like we did. And so, in the very title of this conference, we put this this scary word about water worse, but it's also the linkage with the energy control, right? So sometimes when you react during the emergency, this feeling of panicking and needed to be taking safety seriously and go for desalt, for instance, like Barcelona, then implies something that I just defined, like a locking. When you build a desalt plant or some very big infrastructure, then you have to really know what is it about for you, for your future development. And so you have to know that building that desalts imply a very high energy cost. So each cubic meter of that kind of water is extremely costly respect to other kind of solutions, reusing water, like Kevin was showing you, alternative recycling water, dividing water, splitting water. It's a very specific solution, desalt, which represents a lock-in, because then if Cape Town would have chosen to build 10 desalt plants and relied on that and be safe and produce their water, then there is a trade-off between that solution, providing water safety, and the energy issue of how now I should retrofit my whole energy system to be able to maintain that level of water production, because it's highly energy intense, the desalt water production, right? And this, just to wrap up, the decision that you could be taking for the public safety, okay, longer term decision, if taken during the emergency, could lock in your development path And both in Barcelona and Cape Town, if we go for desal, just to make an example and make you think about that, has indeed a variety of social implications. Because here in Barcelona, we mentioned about the access to water, the water tariff. So if I go for that solution, probably I will have to pay much more for the water because it will become more expensive. And in Cape Town would be an issue here too. And you will be locked to the companies and the utilities which had invested huge amounts of €100 million in that kind of big infrastructure. And so this centralized paradigm of framing, creating, and then in the long term managing that kind of solution will lock our cities to that kind of development path. And what Kevin was showing you, I guess it's very significant. Not because African or Asian or Mexican, but because it's a paradigm shift in a way of thinking. So just outside the emergency, which you need to react, and maybe the decision of build a big diesel plant is obvious and the most politically supported. Then there are a range of alternative solutions, software solutions that we need actually to learn how to do them, because of new options, and we don't have maybe the skills. People are not used to that. We have a certain behavior about water, get rid of water, and so it's really a long-term process through which we need to engage with innovation in a different mindset. And you can do that only after the crisis, right? That's why we thought that this example of Cape Town could be useful for us, because now we are 10 years after the crisis, right? We faced the drought in 2009. Then last year, or just this year, before spring, we have started to warm up the desalt again because the rainfall was just decreasing again. And now, fortunately, last week we have lots of rain. But I mean, maybe it's a good time to frame and to brainstorm about the future we want and decide out of the emergency.